collected data and interpreting the meaning of the data all at the same time. Okay. The goals of description, all right, so they obviously need to be, they need to become familiar with the data. And now they start juggling a lot because they're still in the data collecting process as they start analyzing the data. So they need to become familiar with what they've got, all right? They need to read and reread their notes and their transcripts, okay? They recall observations and experiences. So as they're interviewing these people, as they're out in these real life situations with these people observing, you know, a lot of people like to record it because they can go back and relive it. It's hard to remember. Even if you write down really good notes, really good thorough notes, sometimes it's best to tape it because it's like game tape. You know, you can always go back the day after or weeks after and relive it. All right. They listen to their audio tapes and they view their videotapes. Got to keep it fresh and they got to relive it and remember it like they were there the first time. And they literally become immersed in their data. It becomes, you know, firsthand. They really want to live it and relive it again. All right? So, descriptive analysis. It's like reflexive thought, bracketing, data reduction, and coding. Okay? So this gets a little bit confusing, so everybody's still with me up until this point? Good? All right. So let's talk about these types of descriptive analysis. Reflexive thought. Okay? The researcher explores the personal feelings and experiences of the participants that may influence the study and integrates this understanding into the study. So this is kind of one of the parts where you may get a little bit of the researcher's opinions and emotions involved, because they have to explore these personal feelings and these experiences and then integrate this understanding. What does integrate this understanding mean? You're going to get their own feelings and opinions. Okay? It's very, very subjective. It may differ if somebody else did the same research study. That part might differ a lot. And it requires the researcher to have a conscious awareness of themselves. Because what do you want to avoid? Too much bias, too much opinion. You have to be careful. You still want to remain, you know, neutral, but you are going to get some of your own opinions in there. So you need to have a really good sense of yourself and your background and where you're coming from as you're interpreting this data. Okay? Bracketing. All right? It's used in some of the phenom research to help the research avoid misinterpreting phenomenon as it's being experienced by the participants. Bracketing is suspending or laying aside what the researcher knows about the experience being studied. So you have to kind of take your own thought process or preconceived notions out of it temporarily for the sense of bracketing. That's hard to do, okay? Because everybody's got feelings, everybody's got opinions. So if you're actually going to go ahead and experience this, you need to really lay aside what you know about the experience that's currently being studied. All right, data reduction is the analysis focuses on reducing a large volume of acquired data to facilitate examination. Researcher begins to attach meaning to the elements of the data. And the researcher discovers the classes of things, persons, events, and properties. All right, so it really focuses on reducing a large volume of data to try and come up with a better understanding. And then lastly, there's coding. So coding is a way of indexing or identifying categories in the data. All right, so they're just trying to organize what they've come across so far. Codes may be placed in the data at the time of the data collection, or when done entering the data into the computer, which may be days or weeks later, or during later examination of the data. So they may be sitting on that data for weeks, and then they may go back and start to organize it and code it. All right, and then data segments can then be retrieved by coding categories. So then they can go back weeks and months later and say, okay, I need to look at X, Y, Z and look at the codes that they placed it, systematical organization of that data. So you think about it, if we're talking about, again, abstract information, we're not talking about numbers and we're talking about people's feelings and emotions and experiences, but you still have to keep track of that data that you've compiled. You still have to keep it in some type of organized fashion so that you can look at it again and process it again. You need to have some way of keeping it organized in your own workspace, okay? Data displays. All right, so data displays are equivalent to summary tables used in quantitative studies. All right, so when you guys did all your research so far the past couple weeks and we looked at those sample studies in quantitative, we had summary tables. And it gave you all of your numbers and it gave you your values, okay? So data displays are the same thing used in qualitative research. It allows the research to convey, basically, concisely, the main ideas of the study, okay? And the coding, or the codes, are used to organize that display. So it's just different terminology. It's the same idea as the quantitative that you guys have done so far. It's just that, you know, they call it different things, and they have to, because you're talking about a whole different amount of data. All right, so the types of data analysis, you're looking at coding, memos, storytelling, and narrative analysis. All right, and we'll talk about each one of those. Coding, which we kind of just talked about, is used earlier for description. Okay, so the researcher is going to use coding to describe and organize their data. Can also be used to expand, transform, and reconceptualize that data, providing opportunities for a more diverse analysis. All right, memos are used to record insights or ideas related to the notes, transcripts, or codes. All right, it moves the researcher towards theorizing and is conceptual rather than factual. Does that make sense? It's a little abstract, okay? Memos, it moves the researcher, so it really wants the researcher to start theorizing and coming up with ideas about the research, and it's conceptual rather than factual. And it may link the data or use a specific piece of data as an example of a conceptual idea. So it's a conceptual. It's not hard, cold, you know, facts and figures. All right, storytelling can be instructive in understanding a phenomenon of interest. All right, it includes a sequence of events with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And stories have their own logic and are temporal. All right, and lastly, there's narrative analysis, which is a qualitative means of formally analyzing stories. All right, so the researcher unpacks the story structure. It can be used to determine how people tell stories. So how they shape the events and how they make a point, and how they actually package the events or how they process these events and tuck them away and then react to them, and how they communicate their stories to different audiences. All right, so that's the qualitative means of formally analyzing or describing these stories. So they get all this data, and now they need to interpret the qualitative research, this abstract, subjective research. And the researcher will often offer his or her own interpretation of what is going on. So again, a prime example of how you get the author or the researcher's opinions and feelings and emotions in the study, because right there, they're going to offer their interpretation of what's going on. And the focus is on understanding and explaining beyond that which is being stated with certainty. All right, so the focus is that the researcher is going to say that they understand what's going on, and they're explaining what's going on beyond what's actually happening or what they actually observed. It may focus on usefulness of findings for clinical practice, okay? You would hope that it would. And the researcher develops hunches about relationships that can be used to formulate tentative propositions. So again, you're getting a lot of the researcher's opinions and subjective data in there, okay? So one of the things that you'll hear in qualitative research, Karen's already mentioned it before we even started this topic, is rigor, all right? Rigor needs to be defined differently in qualitative research because the desired outcome of your data and your study is different than that in quantitative research. All right? The evaluation of rigor is based in part on the logic of emerging theory and clarity in which it sheds light on the phenomenon that's studied. Characteristics of rigor. All right, so when you're looking at rigor, you're looking at the openness of the study, the scrupulous adherence to a philosophical perspective. All right, so we talked about how some of the framework of these studies are based on philosophical perspectives. How strict were they in sticking to that philosophical perspective? The actual thoroughness in collecting the data. How thorough were they? How accurate were they? And the consideration of all the data in subjective theory development phase. So did they take into account all of the data that they collected while they were out there in the development phase of getting people's opinions, people's emotions, and their own involved? All right, so there's causes for lack of rigor. There are things that can happen that will cause, a decrease in rigor in your study. Sometimes there's an inconsistency in adhering to the philosophical approach. So they might have started the study with this one philosophical approach, and they were bringing it up and keeping it in mind and following it as a framework and following it as a guideline. Somewhere along the line, they got inconsistent with adhering to that philosophical theory. All right? There might be a failure to get away from older ideas. All right? Maybe they're a little bit stuck in their ways, and they don't want to move their thought process towards newer, progressive ideas. Maybe they had some poorly developed methods, insufficient time spent collecting data, poor observations, and a failure to give careful consideration to all the data. Maybe they were being a little bit too picky and choosy of what they wanted to use or what they wanted to, analyze. All right, so then there's something called decision trails. So the description of decision trails are strategies by which other researchers, using the same data, can follow logic of the original researcher and arrive at the same conclusions. So if you went out and did the same study, okay, using the same data, can you follow the logic of the original researcher? And are you going to arrive at the same conclusions? It requires the researcher to establish rules for categorizing the data, again, trying to stay organized with all of this data, arriving at the ratings, or making judgments. So there's a couple requirements for these decision trails. A record is kept of all of the decision rules used in the data analysis to support the study's conclusions and emerging theory. And all of that raw data that was collected has to be stored and available for review if requested. All right, because if the new researcher wants to get in there and see what was done, all right, and they need to follow that decision trail, they need access to the same exact data, the interviews, the observation notes, the videotapes that the original researcher had. All right, so there's opposition to decision trails. All right, some qualitative researchers are concerned that data analysis would become too mechanic, too robotic, okay, which is what we're trying to move away from with qualitative research. And some qualitative researchers are opposed to the expectation that other researchers will reach the same conclusion when each researcher's work is unique. And it seems like it would be very difficult to reach the same conclusion if you're taking your own subjective thoughts and opinions into consideration, okay? Questions? No? You guys good? It is a little bit more abstract. It's very different from quantitative because you are getting into the open-ended questions and the thoughts and the opinions of your participants, but it can take the researcher in a totally different direction than they ever expected, and it can be, a really great tool for getting people's emotions and opinions involved, and just kind of strays away from the hard facts and figures of quantitative research. So Thank you guys so much.